At 23:40 on December 29, 1944, the cockpit trembled as twin engines idled on a dark strip at Muro, Philippines. Outside the canopy there was no moon, no stars, only thick clouds swallowing the horizon and sound. Major Carroll C. Smith, 26 years old, lean and sharp-featured, crouched forward in the left seat, eyes fixed on instruments glowing pale green. On paper, he was a night fighter pilot tasked to intercept intruders after midnight and keep bombers away from unfinished runways. Tonight, the threat was concrete. 12 Japanese bombers inbound, spread across multiple altitudes, closing at about 180 knots. For 14 straight nights, those bombers had come back again and again, forcing 334 air raid alerts, while engineers slept in tents beside bulldozers and fuel drums. If even a few aircraft reached the field, bombs would tear into construction crews, delay the airstrips, and push the invasion timetable back with real human cost. There were no friendly fighters in daylight patterns, no visual spotting, and no margin for error in total darkness. Behind Smith, a radar scope pulsed quietly, showing what eyes could not, while fuel calculations ticked down with every passing minute. He knew the math already: 1 aircraft against 12 limited fuel, and thousands of lives resting on the outcome. Who decides when the odds make no sense? By late December 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered its final grinding phase. American planners were preparing the invasion of Luzon, the largest and most important island in the Philippines. American planners were preparing the invasion of Luzon, the largest and most important island in the Philippines. At the center of that plan stood the Lingayen Gulf invasion, scheduled for early January, a landing that would put more than 175,000 troops ashore under enemy fire. To make that invasion survivable, air power had to move forward. Fighters needed to operate close enough to provide constant cover over the beaches, the transports, and the supply ships massed offshore. That meant building new airfields on recently secured ground near Muro, carving runways out of coral jungle and mud under combat conditions. Those airfields were not finished bases. They were exposed construction zones lit by kerosene lamps, defended by sandbags and anti-aircraft guns, and crowded with engineers, fuel trucks, and ammunition dumps. At night, most of the men there slept in canvas tents or shallow trenches close enough to the runways to hear bulldozers working after dark. The Japanese understood exactly what those airfields meant. If American fighters could fly from Muro, Japanese bombers and reconnaissance aircraft would lose freedom of movement over the invasion routes. The window to stop that from happening was small, measured in days, not weeks. So they attacked the only way they could, every night. Sometimes with conventional bombers, sometimes with aircraft loaded with explosives and no plan to return. For 2 straight weeks, Japanese aircraft came back again and again, triggering hundreds of air raid alerts. The goal was not always destruction. It was exhaustion, force construction delays, kill enough engineers to slow progress, turn a January landing into a February disaster. Against that pressure, American defenses were thin. Day fighters could not operate in darkness. Searchlights and anti-aircraft fire alone could not reliably stop high-altitude bombers. That left one unit with one specialized mission. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Muro only days earlier. They flew a new aircraft, one designed for a job no other fighter could do: find the enemy at night and stop them before they reached the tents below. On paper, it was a narrow solution to a narrow problem. In reality, it was a thin line stretched across a black sky. And on the night of December 29th, that line was about to be tested. If it failed here, nothing else mattered. Major Carroll C. Smith did not look like the kind of man people imagined when they pictured an ace. At 26, he was lean, quiet, and deliberate, more technician than showman, more calculation than bravado. He spoke little conserved motion, and flew with a discipline that came from repetition rather than impulse. By the winter of 1944, that discipline had already been tested in combat. Smith had flown 43 combat missions before arriving at Muro, logging hours in darkness where mistakes were final. He had 4 confirmed aerial victories to his name, earned not in swirling daylight dogfights, but in black skies where the enemy was found only by instruments. Night fighting was not glamorous work. There were no visual cues, no horizon, no instinctive sense of speed or distance. Everything depended on procedure trust and the ability to make decisions based on glowing lines and numbers rather than sight. Smith's training reflected that reality. For 18 months, he had practiced radar intercepts, fuel management, and gunnery without visual confirmation. Every drill reinforced the same lesson at night. Hesitation was deadlier than aggression, and guesswork killed friendly aircraft as easily as enemy bombers. Behind him in the aircraft sat Lieutenant Philip Porter, his radar operator and equal partner in the mission. Porter read the scope the way other men read terrain, separating friend from foe, predicting turns before they happened. Smith trusted him completely because night fighting was never a solo act. What guided Smith most was a simple belief shaped by experience. Technology mattered, but only when someone accepted the burden of using it at exactly the right moment. Radar engines, cannons, and training meant nothing if the pilot hesitated when the numbers turned ugly. That belief followed him onto the runway at Muro. He understood what failure would cost men he would never meet sleeping in tents under unfinished runways. What he did not yet know was how much this night would ask of him personally, and how close it would bring him to the edge. At 23:42, Porter's voice cut through the intercom with controlled urgency. 4 separate contacts appeared on the radar scope, all moving south toward Muro at different altitudes. They were spread across miles of black sky far enough apart that chasing one meant losing ground on the others. Smith understood the equation instantly. If he chose wrong now, bombers would reach the airfields untouched. He advanced the throttles. The twin Pratt and Whitney engines responded with a deep, even surge as the P-61 climbed at nearly 2,000 feet per minute. Cloud swallowed the aircraft almost immediately, erasing any remaining visual reference. There was only the radar and Porter's calm corrections. Left 5 degrees. Down 3. Hold speed. The first target resolved on Smith's own scope at 3 miles. A steady return, flying straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. At 1 mile, Smith finally saw it as a darker shape against darker clouds. A Japanese Mitsubishi G4M, Betty engines glowing faint orange at the exhausts. At 350 yards, Smith fired a short, concentrated burst. The cannons spoke once. The bomber's wing erupted into flame fuel, igniting instantly. The aircraft rolled and fell, lighting the clouds below before vanishing into the sea. Time 23:57. Fuel burned already more than planned. Porter was already calling the next vector. The second bomber lay 23 miles away, closer to the airfields than the first had been. Smith pushed the Black Widow harder, accepting the fuel penalty to close the distance. Every minute at high power cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. There was no alternative. At 0014, the second contact filled the scope. Another Betty lower this time, riding just above the cloud layer. Smith slid into position from below and behind, keeping the aircraft steady. 2 seconds of fire were enough. The bomber burned and fell at 0019. Now the numbers turned ugly. 2 bombers down. 10 still airborne. Fuel remaining just over 40%. Porter's scope showed 2 more contacts, 1 high and 1 low, 8 miles apart. Smith had to choose. He took the higher target first, climbing because climbing cost less fuel than a rapid descent. But every second spent climbing gave the lower bomber more freedom to run. The third contact did not behave like the others. It turned, climbed, descended, and altered course unpredictably. This was no Betty. It was a Nakajima Key 49 Helen, faster and better armed. Smith adjusted his approach, coming in from below and offset to avoid the tail gunner. At 375 yards, tracers suddenly streaked past his canopy. The bomber had spotted him. Surprise was gone. Smith fired a longer burst. The Helen's engine exploded, and the aircraft spun down into darkness at 0029. Fuel remaining under 30%. Now only 1 bomber remained on Porter's scope. The one Smith had delayed. Low altitude, and dangerously close to Muro. Smith descended, trading altitude for speed and fuel conservation. Searchlights from the airfields were now visible, thin white fingers probing the clouds. At 0034, Smith fired his 4th attack of the night. The Betty broke apart and burned into the ocean less than a minute later. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. The radar scope went briefly empty. Smith turned for home. Then Porter spoke again. Another contact. between them and the runway, and Smith was nearly out of fuel. Porter's voice came back low and precise. A new contact, heading north, altitude about 7,000 feet. Smith glanced at the fuel gauge, just under 20%. Below the margin most pilots used to turn back. The contact sat directly between the Black Widow and the runway at Muro. If it was another bomber, it would be minutes from the tents and fuel dumps Smith had just protected. If he ignored it, everything he had done tonight could unravel in a single pass. Smith turned toward the contact. As the range closed, the return sharpened on the scope. This one was smaller, faster, a single engine. At 800 yards, Smith finally saw it. A Nakajima Ki-84. Hayate, the Japanese fighter the Americans called the Frank. In daylight, it was faster, lighter, and more agile than the P-61. At night, it was blind. Smith eased in from below and behind, keeping the fighter centered in the gun sight. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Fuel ticked down with every second. 17%. No room for a second attempt. If he fired and missed, he would not make it back to base. If he turned away, the fighter would have a clear run toward the airfields. There was no safe option left. Smith settled the reticle, held it steady, and committed. He squeezed the trigger. The longest burst of the night tore through the fighter's tail and engine cowling. Flame poured back along the fuselage as the Frank rolled and dove away. At 3,000 feet, the pilot bailed out a pale parachute blooming briefly in the black sky. Smith watched the burning aircraft strike the water at 0046. Then he looked back at the fuel gauge. 15%. He turned south toward Muro engines, throttled back every movement measured. The fight was over. Now he still had to survive the night. And the hardest part was not finished. The radar scope finally went quiet. No new returns. No shapes moving through the dark. Behind Smith, the sea swallowed the last burning wreckage, leaving only smoke smearing the clouds. 5 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in less than an hour. 4 bombers and 1 fighter all lost before reaching the airfields. On the ground at Muro, nothing exploded. No bombs fell among fuel drums or bulldozers. Engineers kept working through the nightlights, low machines running runway surfaces, slowly taking shape. Smith's fuel gauge told a harsher story. 15%. Barely enough to reach the field. As he approached the coast, the island finally appeared on the radar as a dark mass rising from the sea. Muro lay just inland, its unfinished runway marked only by a thin row of kerosene lamps. Smith descended carefully, engines throttled back, conserving every possible ounce of fuel. Then the lights vanished. All of them. The runway disappeared into complete darkness as Smith flew toward where it should have been. With no visual references, no margin to climb and try again, he had one option left. Instruments only. Porter called out of altitude from the radar altimeter as Smith eased the aircraft down. 500 feet. 300. 100. The Black Widow struck crushed coral hard but straight. The landing gear held. The aircraft rolled to a stop with minutes of fuel remaining. By the numbers, the night was decisive. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed. 0 American casualties on the ground. No damage to the airfields. No delay to the invasion schedule. The Japanese did not return in force that night. The pattern of constant harassment attacks broke. And when dawn came, the runways at Muro were still intact. What had been a thin line in the dark had held. Barely. But the cost of that night was not finished revealing itself. By dawn on December 30th, 1944, the numbers were already clear. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed in one night. 7 confirmed victories in less than 24 hours. That total made Carroll C. Smith the highest-scoring American night fighter ace of the war. No other U.S. pilot in any theater would match that concentration of success in darkness. Yet there was no ceremony on the runway that morning. No crowd, no speeches. On paper, the achievement lived in after-action reports and intelligence summaries. 4 Mitsubishi G-4M bombers. 1 Nakajima Ki-49 bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-84 fighter, times altitudes coordinates, cold, precise lines of text. What those lines could not capture was what never happened. No bombs falling among fuel dumps. No engineers killed beside half-finished runways. No delay to the air cover that would protect the invasion force days later at the Lingayen Gulf invasion. Because the airfields at Muro survived, American fighters were overhead when the landings began on January 9, 1945. Engineers estimated that successful Japanese attacks would have delayed completion by at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks that would have cost lives on the beaches, in the transports, and inland. Smith never tried to turn that night into a legend. After the war, he returned home, left the service, and lived as a civilian. He wrote no memoir. He sought no spotlight. Like many men whose most important work happened in darkness, he let the record speak quietly for itself. Even the aircraft did not survive to become a museum piece. Most P-61 Black Widows were scrapped after the war, victims of changing technology and shrinking budgets. The machine that hunted unseen and protected thousands vanished almost completely from public memory. But the meaning of that night remains. It is not just a story about radar speed or firepower. It is a story about preparation meeting responsibility and about decisions made when the margin disappears entirely. If you are watching this today, there is a reason this story matters now. Somewhere in your family or your community, someone once carried a quiet burden that never made headlines. They did their job, protected others, and went home without asking to be remembered. Tonight, ask them about it if you can. And listen, if this story helped you understand the war a little differently, hit like so the algorithm carries it to someone who has never heard this name. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more true stories about people who carried extraordinary responsibility without applause. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and whether someone in your family served. That is how these memories stay alive. Not in archives alone, but in people who choose to remember.